Welcome participants to the webinar on VAT compliance and administration. This is a very important topic that we are adding to our webinar series. Some of you that has participated in previous version from different part of the world. So I should say good morning to some people, or good afternoon to others, and maybe good night to some of our participants. We are very delighted to be in this 4 of the webinar series to refocus a bit the discussion on the contribution of VAT to the revenue mobilization. As you know, the international discussion lately has been relatively focused on corporate taxation, particularly international taxation, and on all the headaches this has created for so many countries and administration. However, we thought that it would be important to retake the focus also on another very important vehicle of financing governments, VAT. As you know, VAT it's one of the main taxes in many countries, and there has been a lot of discussion, though not so publicly, in some of the features of VAT in terms of their design, in terms of sometimes controversies, difficulties on the administration regarding distributional issues, the incidents, and definitely the management of compliance with VAT. So the webinar series on VAT, which is financed under the Revenue Mobilization Trust Fund, the IMF vehicle for supporting countries in the effort of revenue mobilization, is providing the opportunity for an interactive, lively discussion and trying to cover all those issues of VAT. And how these issues have been addressed by experience from different countries. As I said, this is the 4th of a series of webinars. We have so far hosted 3 of them regarding the VAT experience, looking back on VAT development the last 20 years. That was the first of the seminars. And then we have another webinar focused on VAT and COVID-19. Sadly, COVID-19 has impacted significantly revenue all over the world, and VAT is a tax that probably suffers the most, because with the measure of lockdown in several countries, sadly economic activity was sometime decline, and this impact directly VAT, which is a tax on transactions. The third webinar was focused more on design and administration issue, was focused on the equity, the efficiency, the VAT administration. This 4 webinar will discuss more revenue administration issues, including priorities for effective management of VAT. It will explore experiences and lessons learned in managing VAT compliance and administration, including the interaction with VAT design. So administration is not independent on how the VAT is designed. That's why it's important always to keep in mind that aspect. It will touch upon other topics as well, the use and insight from analytical tools like the program in the IMF called RGAP, which is Revenue Administration Gap Analysis Program, that try to measure compliance level as a precondition for good administration. So the notion behind this is that having a more kind of understanding of how compliance behave enable better compliance management. There will be also experience related to compliant risk management, which is one of the more structured approach to manage taxes, VAT in particular. And in the case of VAT, some burning issues like managing the credit of VAT and the refund of VAT. VAT fraud is also something that administrators always struggle, and we will hear some lesson here during this discussion. And definitely one aspect that has been at the forefront of discussion lately is the use of technology, how technology enable a better administration of taxes, particularly VAT. My personal experience with this, it's pretty telling when we introduce electronic invoices in Chile, my country, when I was commissioner some years ago. So in this regard, this webinar will allow us to do all this journey through different topics. Just to set the scene for the webinar, this is organized in two parts. The first part will include a presentation by my colleague, Katherine Baer, to set the scene of the discussion during this webinar. And the second part, after the presentation, we will have a panel with distinguished panelists that I will introduce in a minute to prepare all the scenario for discussion. The second part is for your participation all over the world. So raising question, sharing your thought, comments, take advantage of the panelists and raise direct question on their specific experience and cases, but also to share more broad experience regarding what our institution, the IMF, has been doing. So I encourage participation from panelists and participants in the interactive and lively event. So remember, this is the fourth event of a series of VAT webinar. We are expecting to have a very lively debate. And let me briefly introduce who will be with us today, sharing experience from an IMF perspective, but also from country and region perspective. So, as I said, we will open the floor with a presentation by Katherine Baer, who is going to give us a presentation on a framework for effective management of VAT compliance. This is based on the experience the IMF has gathered from so many activities we engage with countries in supporting revenue mobilization effort from a policy perspective, but also from a revenue administration perspective, which is the focus of this webinar. So Katherine is Assistant Director in the Fiscal Affairs Department with a long experience in providing technical assistance in many countries. Particularly, she's managing now the technical assistant of the IMF for the regions in Sub-Saharan Africa, Western Hemisphere, and the Caribbean. So Katherine has had the opportunity also to engage with a direct capacity development technical assistant in so many countries over the world, including her own experience in the US Treasury and also in the Mexican Revenue Administration. So will take us to a journey of very interesting information about how to manage effectively VAT, particularly using analytics and some of the tools we have been developing here at the IMF. So without further ado, I will ask Katherine to start the presentation, and after Katherine's presentation, I will introduce our distinguished panelists that will debate and comment in some specific aspect we will be listening from Katherine. Katherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juan, for that very nice introduction. Let me get started here as soon as the screen is up and running. So good morning to everyone around the world. A very warm welcome and greeting to all my colleagues and friends who are listening in today. So as you said, Juan, I'll be talking about managing VAT compliance and administration. Let's set the stage for our discussion today. Next, please. Next slide, please. So the first slide, and important for setting the stage for our discussion this morning, has to do with measuring VAT compliance gaps by income level and region. What do the compliance gaps say that we have measured, as Juan indicated, via our RA Gap program, advising a number of countries? Here, this represents the results from VAT gap analyses in 32 countries over all the regions in the world. And what we see on the left-hand side is that compliance gaps are higher in lower income countries, and of course lower in higher income countries. Quite a difference. The low income country median is around more than 4 points of GDP, and the high income country median is around 2 points of GDP. And this is only for the sample we have, not all the countries. So already a major difference, twice the gap in low income countries versus high income countries. Of course, this translates into the gaps, or explains the gaps by regions of the world, because that's where in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where the low income countries are more represented, and therefore Africa has generally a higher median gap on the order of 4%, and in some countries higher, whereas the countries in Europe where the gap is measured, and some countries in Asia, the gap is relatively lower. So what we're seeing here is that compliance gaps are higher in lower income countries, and that this explains the regional differences we see. Next slide, please. We also see, as a result of the RA Gap exercises, that there are a few economic sectors that typically contribute to the largest compliance gaps. This is one of the features of this RA Gap measurement or methodology, that it allows us to see what the gaps are by different sectors in the economy. And that's a huge value when we start designing compliance improvement programs. So what we see here as a result of these, again, VAT gap studies conducted in 32 countries, is that the construction and the trade sectors have the largest average compliance gaps, as you can see on the left-hand side, as a percent of GDP. And also there are large gaps in manufacturing, hospitality, and professional services. Kind of interesting, for example, that one would see such a high gap in manufacturing, given that VAT is, has a self-enforcement feature, and that here one would expect that that self-enforcement feature would be working more effectively in a sector such as the manufacturing sector. But in fact, there are large gaps in the manufacturing sector. And of course, construction, as we know, where there is a lot of difficult compliance activity in that sector, specifically having to do with the contracting industry in that sector. So a few sectors typically contributing to the largest compliance gaps in the sample where RA gap measures have been made. Next slide, please. So against that background, what would be some of the prerequisites for a well-functioning VAT? Juan mentioned that we would be looking at those. And here there are around 6 that we've highlighted. First and foremost, of course, it's a good design of VAT policy and a legal framework. And by good design, we've talked about that in the first 3 webinars focusing on the VAT, but we are talking inter alia about a VAT with a broad base, few exceptions, exemptions, and a simple rate structure, one or not many differentiated VAT rates. So having a good design is very important. Also important is the careful setting and adjusting of the VAT registration threshold, which many countries set, but then do not really analyze what the effect is on the behavior of taxpayers around that threshold. Here, the idea is that countries should keep an eye on not having too many small taxpayers in the VAT net that generate a lot of work for the administration and not much revenue, or in fact, sometimes negative revenue. So careful adjusting of the VAT threshold is very important. Of course, having a self-assessed tax, a tax where taxpayers determine their own liability based on their commercial activity, is very important, and that VAT have digital and efficient processes. A fourth aspect, and as we know, not only for the VAT, but for all the major taxes, is extensive use of third-party data and robust analytics to ensure compliance and to check information from other sources than the declaring taxpayer, VAT payer. So extensive use of third-party data and robust analytics, very important to help ensure VAT compliance. And among that use of third-party data, of course, is included the data from customs administrations that can be cross-checked against the VAT declared by taxpayers on the domestic tax side. So VAT paid on imports and the value of those imports versus that declared on the domestic tax side, very important as a way to cross-check that information and ensure compliance with both obligations. And finally, but definitely not the least, is having a well-resourced tax administration with a sound institutional framework. There's so few words, but so important and often a difficult objective to reach, but having a well-resourced tax administration and a sound institutional framework, essential prerequisites for a well-functioning VAT. Next, please. This interrelated circle highlights the various aspects, the key aspects of VAT compliance risk management framework. Juan mentioned also in his introductory remarks that we at the IMF focus a lot of our assistance to countries or advice to countries on this integrated approach to ensuring and building the basis for good compliance risk management for the VAT. And one of the important aspects of this is that an integrated focus is key. That is, all of these pieces of the puzzle are important in order for VAT compliance to be well administered. And what do we mean by the various pieces of the puzzle? Starting with the little black tier, facilitating compliance, having good taxpayer services and taxpayer information, controlling and monitoring registration, who is in the net, who is registered, and who should or should not be registered, very important. Administering on-time filing and payment of VAT, which sounds fairly straightforward, but many countries do not focus sufficiently on these basic compliance obligations. Controlling the veracity of invoices, which many countries are doing, and focusing in particular on the introduction of e-invoicing around the world. Verifying accurate reporting, the audit activity, which is also sometimes not well designed or not with sufficient coverage and focused on the appropriate issues, compliance issues that are VAT related. And of course, managing VAT credits and refunds effectively. We often call that management of credits and refunds the Achilles heel of the VAT, and it is indeed one of the more difficult aspects of VAT management. But having this integrated focus is really one of the secrets or one of the keys to having effective compliance risk management. Some countries we see a good focus on facilitating compliance, a lot of focus on controlling invoices, some focus on some audit activity, but some of the other aspects are not well covered. So integration is the focus here. Next slide, please. I'd like to say a word about VAT refunds. And here, what is interesting, based on the data that we obtained from approximately 70 countries around the world, based on the TADAT data, shows that the proportion of VAT refunded increases with a country's income level. And this may also be related to the size of the VAT gaps that we saw earlier. So just looking at the graph here, one sees that VAT refunds as a percent of gross VAT collections, the median increases from the low-income countries to the high-income countries. Of course, there is quite a range in the measures here, but the trend is definitely upwards, with more VAT refunded as a percent of gross VAT collections in the higher income countries than in the lower income countries. So what is interesting here is to think back to the slide that I showed about the gaps, and probably more research is needed that to investigate whether a better functioning VAT refund mechanism, does it encourage compliance and contribute to lower VAT gaps? In other words, because refunding is such an essential aspect of the VAT, to what extent is a well-functioning VAT refund mechanism associated with having more compliance, higher compliance, and lower VAT gaps? And there's probably a link there, although of course there are other aspects related, as we saw on the slide that I showed on the integrated compliance approach, other activities such as audit and control of filing and payment, of course. Next slide, please. I'd like to focus a bit on the issue of resourcing and the importance of tax administrations needing to have the resources to perform effectively for all the major taxes, including the VAT. And here, what we've seen based on information drawing from the ISORA data, which is the International Survey on Revenue Administration for 2018 data, is that it's evident that lower income countries are less well-resourced as measured by staff to country population. On the left-hand side, we see the tax administration staff per citizen measured by full-time equivalents, FTEs, is clearly considerably lower in the lower income countries as compared to the upper middle income and higher income countries, with a difference being very striking, around 8 times more, the order of magnitude of 8 times more tax administration staff per citizen in the higher income countries versus the lower income countries. So stark differences there. And what this means in terms of a tax administration's audit activity and audit capacity is that those administrations with less staff are, of course, less able to devote resources to audit and verification activities that are really important for ensuring compliance, detecting underreporting, evasion, and other types of, and fraud. And here the graph shows that there is a lower percent of staff allocated to audit, investigation, and other verification activities in the lower income countries versus the upper middle income and high income countries. Next slide, please. A very important aspect, especially with the digital revolution in public finances, is the extent of digitalization in a tax administration, which of course also affects the value-added tax administration. And what we have seen based on data from ISORA 2018, and of course using the IMF's WIO data, is that overall tax administrations with a greater degree of digitalization are associated with higher tax to GDP ratios. There are other factors at work, of course, but this scatter plot shows that, for example, the high income countries, which show a higher degree of digitalization, that means greater e-filing, e-payment, and other e-procedures, tend to have higher tax revenue to GDP percentages compared to lower income countries. And of course, one would expect that as these lower income countries adopt more digital processes and procedures, that would help them increase their tax revenue performance and go towards the region of the blue of the higher income countries. So digitalization clearly related to revenue performance and overall outcome of tax administration's work. The next slide, please. And this slide shows a nice relationship of or how digitalization is affecting VAT administration via multiple channels. Starting in here just 6 channels are highlighted, from legal provisions to more sophisticated learning machines. But examples of how digitalization is affecting VAT administration, starting, for example, with adjusting legal provisions to legalize digitalization products and granting legal powers to the authorities, to data gathering, electronic tax return, and third-party information to help reduce taxpayers' burdens and to improve the quality of the data, allowing data matching to enhance results-based management, to allow risk management techniques or inform risk management techniques, to help categorize and select taxpayers for audit, and also undertake customs audits and examinations, to offer an array of digital services that we know are being adopted quickly around the world, such as e-invoicing, the use of cloud services, the use of mobile devices and apps to facilitate taxpayers and traders access to tax and customs, linking to bank services, and also improving security and transparency. The use of digital tools such as pre-filled tax returns, electronic notifications, and other tools to reduce paper-based processes, also to improve services to taxpayers, possibly to help speed up tax arrears collection, and of course, learning machines to improve taxpayers' experiences, reduce compliance burdens, and allowing the tax administration to target approaches on non-compliant taxpayers, also increasing transparency and accountability. So through this small blue graph, just a summary of how digitalization can affect or is affecting VAT administration via multiple channels. So with that, colleagues, I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in to this introduction to set the stage for our discussion, which I very much look forward to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Very enlightened presentations, touching upon several of the topics we are planning to cover during this webinar. Interesting the connection on all the topics you mentioned, starting from having a good understanding of compliant trends and comparison with other countries, and trying to measure some of the important features of VAT, the compliance and the revenue trends and the resources. Not just relying on self-assessment. There is some question in the chat related to self-assessment. VAT is a self-assessed tax that many of the taxes that administration nowadays are in charge of. But having a self-assessment tax doesn't mean that the administration does not develop a good understanding of that behavior and also establish a pretty structured way to manage the tax compliance. And you show a nice wheel on how the administration should try to aim and manage actively VAT, even though it's a self-assessment tax, which is something that sometimes we tend to forget. We relied on the good faith and the taxpayer compliant culture, but we need to be vigilant as an administrator in order to really ensure that compliance is maximized, and certainly dealing with some hot topics like the refund and managing the credit, and leverage as much as possible technology. And you show at the end a nice chart with the possibilities of technology in terms of the different aspects of administering VAT. So very, very good presentation to set the scene of what we plan to hear next, which is our panel. And we have a pretty distinguished panelist. So I would like to introduce our panel that will be organized along the following lines. So we have a a set of a couple of questions to all panelists. We will go first for the first round, and then you will listen different experiences in the first round, and then we go for a second round. In the meantime, I suggest all participants to start writing down their own questions. So please use the chat, send the question to the chat. We will be managing as efficient as possible the chat, so be able to accommodate, hopefully, all the questions from participants during the second part of this webinar, which is focused on Q&A. Q&A to Katherine and the panelists. So please be prepared, pay attention, because lots is going on and lots of information is being shared during the presentation that is motivating now our discussion to the panel. So for the panel, I said we have 4 distinguished panelists, and the order of the panelists, you have the brochure of the conference, so I will do a very brief introduction of the panelists, so we have more time for the lively debate. Our first speaker is Michael Walpole. He is from the University of New South Wales, Australia. Michael has a quite extensive experience in the academia, but also working in OECD and Australia and several centers analyzing VAT compliance and other taxes as well, but particularly analyzing and participating in several projects related to VAT, research in different aspects of VAT, more lately in the compliant cost, which is the main topic Michael will refer during his presentation, so his intervention, which is about having a little bit of a diagnostic of VAT compliant burden, something that is very important in the administration of any tax. What is the burden we impose to taxpayers in order to comply? And as we always say, it's the lowest the compliance, the better the administration and for taxpayer to comply. But of course, there is a balance in having a very low compliance and a strong compliance enforcement capability. So Michael will share with us some of his research in this area, which is, again, a very important aspect to pay attention when we administer VAT. Our second speaker is Mary Bain. Mary also with a long experience in tax administration as a commissioner at the Rwanda Revenue Authority, but currently as director of the tax program of the African Tax Administration Forum. And since that position, Mary has been able to gather experience from countries all over sub-Saharan Africa, and will share with us experience in that sense, particularly in the area of addressing VAT compliance gaps. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, there is a mixed experience in terms of managing VAT compliance, with some countries with high level of non-compliance, other countries with low level of non-compliance. So there is a mix and very rich experience that Mary will share with us. Our third speaker, Danil Egorov, is the commissioner of the Federal Tax Service of Russia since January 2020. And Danil has been working in the Federal Tax Service in Russia for several years. And as some people probably know, Russia has been a country where the tax administration has been leveraging technology quite extensively. And today, it's one of the leader in using technology for managing taxpayer compliance, particularly in the area of VAT. And Danil has been in charge of several of those projects that has been developing different aspects of the VAT compliance cycle, where the technology has been leveraged to improve compliance management, and he will be able to share with us some of that experience. And last but not least, we have Margarita Faral, who is the tax commissioner from the Revenue Administration in Uruguay. Uruguay is a country that also has a very good experience in managing VAT compliance. Uruguay is one of the countries early adopted of VAT, so there is a quite extensive years of experience that has been accumulated in experiences with the tax policy framework on one hand, but also on the revenue administration. So we have here in this panel the perspective of different countries, but different regions and different experience also, including from the academia. So it's a very nice combination of panelists for quite a substantive topic, which is how we ensure a better administration of VAT, and particularly better level of compliance, which is ultimately one of the key objectives of an administration. How to ensure that compliance is high, is not burdensome, and collect enough revenues for the government in countries to provide the services and help in alleviate taxpayer when needed, particularly during this COVID-19. The revenue component of the public finances has played quite a significant role when citizen has been in need of help, businesses has in need of help. So is when the revenues really demonstrate one of the key objectives why tax system is so important, and why collecting revenues in an efficient manner is so important. Certainly to finance infrastructure, education, development agenda, but facing the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, revenue has played a quite significant role for governments. So without further ado, and I see the Q&A is increasing now in the chat, so this is wonderful, and you will have the opportunity to continue raising your question. So panelists will be preparing for answering all the questions here live, or eventually, if we are not able to cover all, we would definitely will respond remotely. So without further ado, let me start with Michael. And Michael, thank you very much for engaging, because I know that this webinar with the universal coverage allows some people participating from all over the world, but some of them, like in your case, from pretty late at night. So appreciate your effort. So in the topic you have been researching, Michael, so over the last decade, there has been several approaches that has been used in order to try to measure drivers of the taxpayer burden in compliance, and what is the kind of heavy kind of burden administration eventually imposed to taxpayer to compliance instead of being more light. So, and always is a little bit of an obsession from administration to reduce compliance burden, but one of the issues is how we measure that reduction, how we measure if we are moving in the right direction or not. So could you tell us about how you see the different experience in measuring in what is the advantage of eventually different measurement of compliance burden and the advantage and disadvantages? Michael?
Certainly, Juan. Thank you, Juan. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yes.
Yes.
And thank you for your gracious introduction. I'll just acknowledge as I start that in the room as participants are my colleagues and collaborators over many years, Professor Bintran Nam and Professor Chris Evans. And we started looking at tax compliance costs in Australia in 1996. And we used at that time a methodology that is probably one of the most sound and thorough, and that is a mailed survey. And we had a questionnaire and we sent it out to thousands of taxpayers, and that was one of the early types. I mean, it's still used, a distributed survey, but one of the early types of means of measuring these costs. The problem with those kinds of surveys, of course, are the scale and cost, make them quite hard to administer frequently, and response rates are always a problem. And that a low response rate can often undermine the efficacy of such a survey. In light of that, other tools have developed over the years, and they would be known to many of the people on this call. For example, the standard cost model, the doing business model. Those we think have not, for compliance costs, been entirely satisfactory. Standard cost model is actually a very good one, but there are criticisms of it. It's based on an estimate of costs based on a normally efficient business, and that's a construct rather than a real thing. So concerns are being expressed about how representative that is. It doesn't pick up voluntary compliance costs. I noticed some work by François Vaillancourt who said that it lacks representativeness. The doing business model is probably received more criticisms. It also has a problem of being representative in that it's based on a hypothetical. And a professional fills in a survey based on this hypothesis that it's a survey for I think it's a factory producing flower pots, something like that. It incorporates in its assessment of burden, it also incorporates the rate of tax, which is actually the tax burden, not the compliance burden. So we looked further for other ways of measuring these costs. And of course, what has developed more recently is diagnostic tools, and some very good diagnostic tools like TADAT, other diagnostic tools like the Europe's Fiscal Blueprint. But those we found don't actually discretely measure compliance costs. They measure a lot of things, identify a lot of things, not compliance costs. So we decided we would actually attempt to identify compliance costs with a compliance costs diagnostic tool. And we worked with Richard Highfield, who's probably known to many of the people here, and with KPMG. And what we did there was and I'll talk a bit more about it later, we identified what we regarded as the costly aspects of a tax system, a VAT system, and identified whether a particular jurisdiction had those costly aspects. And from that, you can tell that there is a compliance costs or potentially a compliance costs issue in that jurisdiction without having to send out a survey or anything like that. You look at features of the system. Now, I think you're going to give me an opportunity later to discuss some of those features. So I'll stop there and hand back to you. Thank you.
Indeed, you will have the opportunity to explain in detail the approach you have been developing for measuring those costly aspects. And you mentioned the diagnostic tools of TADAT and also blueprints. And indeed, those has a different focus because when TADAT was developed, the idea was creating an objective tools that has a evidence-based approach for trying to diagnose the health of a tax administration in different countries, region, etc., based on, and this is very important, based on the outcomes that tax administration should be pursuing. So that's the focus of TADAT. In this regard, is not focused on measuring cost, is measuring on how a tax administration is achieving outcomes in 9 performance outcome areas with a standard approach and indicators, dimension, and the idea is to apply this in a pretty kind of standardized and well informed approach, which is interesting what you said, because you will describe further, but your intention is also developing a tool with some features, but focus particularly on the cost aspect. So looking forward to hear in the second part. So let me move to Mary. As I mentioned in the introduction, in the region in Africa, we have a variety of measurement of taxpayer compliance, and in some countries it's the taxpayer non-compliance or compliance gap is very high, 50–60% in some of them. So Mary, what do you think this is the case, and what the key reform are needed to reverse these trends? Because having a compliance gap of 50% is like losing half of the taxes that should be collected. The floor is yours, Mary.
Thank you very much, Juan, and hello, everybody. So Juan, in answering your question, I want to give a bit of a background regarding VAT in Africa. So is VAT important to Africa? And then after that, I'll give some examples, and then we can take it up from there. So VAT's importance to Africa is absolute, because VAT consistently provides in excess of 30% of the revenues, according to the African Tax Outlook, a publication of the African Tax Administration Forum. And clearly for the last 3 years, VAT has consistently come, at the top of the tax bracket, and it demonstrates, this demonstrates its primary fiscal function for the African economies. I also want to say that it is really considered as both comparatively cheap and efficient to collect, with the highest contribution to total tax, as I said. Now, is there efficiency in its collection? And this will help me then to respond to what you said. So to determine this, ATAF usually uses the C efficiency model to try and determine this. Again, in the African Tax Outlook, this was applied to 13 countries that were participating in its 2019 edition. And in this edition, it was found that the average C efficiency for ATO countries is at 43.7%, with the highest being the Republic of South Africa and the lowest being at 14% for DRC. So the Republic of South Africa is at 90%, while the DRC is at 14%. So of course, I know that some colleagues will say that C efficiency doesn't differentiate between the policy gap and compliance gap contributions to the efficiency of the VAT system. But Michael Keane in The Anatomy of VAT states that low efficiency levels in developing countries is largely attributable to the compliance gap. So I want to say, what are the compliance gaps? And this, of course, will help me answer your question. Some of the issues that inform these compliance gaps in Africa are, one, the limited data. And again, my references to the ATO countries, where challenges of collecting data on critical indicators such as nil filing, the nil returns from taxpayers, etc., is really limited. This greatly affects the effective operation of these areas, such as risk assessment, audit, enforcement, etc. And so it is really crucial in determining compliance or the lack thereof. And so in the absence of this, there is a huge problem. Secondly, there are also difficulties in obtaining data on key elements relating to the performance of the audit function, such as the number and value of assessments. All these, of course, are fundamentals of management information that would then inform the type of audit, the performance of the teams and individuals who are required to, to carry out this work. So in terms of the remedies that I really can think of, I think tax administrations in Africa need to build efficient and robust data collection frameworks. There's also a NATAP data bank, which is really an online tool that we have provided, and this can be used by countries as a driver for authorities to improve data collection functions. And then there's also the automation or digitization of VAT compliance and administration processes that can be used and will go beyond enhancing the ease of compliance. The second area, the second gap is limited audit resourcing. And I was keenly listening to Katherine, and she did mention this as a key area to support efficiency in VAT. So let's look at what the situation is for Africa. So in Africa, the average staff to auditor ratio in the ATO countries that I mentioned, again, is at 20%. This is 10 percentage points below the international benchmark. So our conclusion here is that staff shortage remains a crucial challenge to our countries, with an average taxpayer to auditor ratio of 1,044 taxpayers to one auditor, which clearly is very, unsustainable. Then there are key areas that keep surfacing as challenges, which is like adopting technological solutions in audit, robust compliance risk management systems, enhanced data management, strengthening of internal departmental synergies. And then there is also the lack of aggregated data and compliance audit resources for VAT, with many authorities not having dedicated VAT compliance resources. This too was mentioned in the presentation. So some of the remedies to that could be tax administrations in Africa building up human resources in the area of tax compliance and the deployment of technology in forms such as automated risk assessment framework. Then the fourth area is a huge shadow economy. And one, this is really a key issue in Africa. It is something that Africa continues to grapple with. And so this too is a serious gap, and the remedy here could be addressing the impact of the informal economy on VAT compliance in Africa, and its inclusion and financial transaction visibility structures that can facilitate the formalization and bringing into the tax net of the different operators. Then the fifth is really digitalizing processes. I think that was spoken of, and I will not really dwell on it. The remedy here would be also the need for interdepartmental synergies, especially where the exchange of information is in real time. And then, of course, taxpayer engagement and regular communication. So a good example of this practice is the Republic of South Africa, that has really introduced a tool that has objectively improved its efficiency and management of its VAT gaps. And this tool continues to help SALs to minimize revenue risk, and it has clear indicators, and this is actually in the public domain, so people can go back and look at it. And this, again, as I conclude here, Juan, I think it is easy to fall into complacency, thinking that VAT will collect itself as being one of the easiest to collect. And of course, there's a common notion that it is self-policing. However, there's need for constant vigilance, and it's also important to maintain the tax. This would be important in maintaining the tax base and in addressing and mitigating serious compliance issues. The challenge is to keep developing and refining new compliance techniques to reflect, the times challenges and data management and data streams and limited physical access to businesses, and not to be so captivated by technology that sometimes we forget some of these key issues. So I'll stop there for now, and I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. You share several very important aspects, and I would like to highlight the first one you mentioned, that somehow it's related to what Katherine showed at the beginning of the presentation, is collecting good data from taxpayer compliance, having a good understanding of why there is a certain revenue trends, upward or downward, and have better data for understanding the behavior of compliance, and behavior of taxpayers in compliance. So this is certainly something to continue working. I remember when we initiated the development of TADAT with several organization partners at the AMF, we launched in parallel another initiative that was called RFIT, Revenue Administration Fiscal Information Tool. And we were wrestling if we should start TADAT or RFIT. And we decided that at that time, it was better to start with RFIT, which was basically collecting information about different performance indicator of tax administration. And this was important to create a base of comparative information. Instead, TADAT was more a diagnostic tool, but in order to make a diagnostic, you need to have some basic data. And this is why RFIT was first developed. And then we partnered with OECD, CET, and IOTA, and ISORA was created, which is something that it's a very important tool for gathering information across different administration and have information available for tax administrator to have access to comparative information. So having this understanding is so important. And also very important what you said at the end of your presentation, and this is a good segue for the next speaker, the use and leveraging technology for managing a taxpayer that's supposed to be self-control, as you said, but actually we have to remain vigilant. And technology definitely help us to remain vigilant because it enables us to collect information in a very efficient, effective way, and somehow put the tax administration at the forefront of taking advantage of the new economy. As we heard and read and listen, today technology is dominating the way of doing businesses. So how the administration take advantage of that wave of technology and digitalization revolution. And I would like to invite Daniel, who has experience by himself, but now leading one of the administration that has leveraged technology quite significantly, that he shared the experience how the Federal Tax Service is using technology to address one of the challenges in VAT, which is VAT fraud. As we listen in the presentation from Katherine, VAT has several areas of risks, and some of those areas of risks ended up in fraud and fraud to the government, cheating the government, VAT fraud on refunds, and VAT fraud in abusing of credit, excess credit, or definitely going into the shadow economy, a problem that Mary also alluded as one of the significant challenge in Africa. So Daniel, please tell us about the experience of the Federal Tax Service.
Juan, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I hope I'll be able to share our insights in digitalization of tax service and of some of taxes, including VAT. I think it would be interesting to know that we came to conclusion that if you want to change something with help of digitalization, first thing that we have to understand as tax administration, the tax administration doesn't start on the board of tax administration. Tax administration starts on the board of taxpayer. And we have to understand that when we implement some technologies, we have to measure the digital maturity of all the stakeholders. Are they ready for new steps, for digital steps to implement something new? Because if we will be too fast, if we will be too radical, that means that we will have a big resistance in what we are doing, including digitalization. That's the first thing that we saw implementing our technology. The other thing is that there are 3 fields on which we have to look closely during this implementation. First of all, it's regulation, and we have to understand which way we will choose to, if I may say so, to electrify our connections, our communication with taxpayer. The other thing is our capability, where I'm talking about software and the data management. And the third one is our enforcement. That means how the audit relies on the data and how they are interconnected. That's also was a huge challenge for us. What we've done let me say, in 2010, VAT was absolutely notorious tax in Russian Federation, and government thought maybe to take it away from the field and choose some kind of other tax because there was quite a lot of fraud. And we tried to find something quite accurate for the taxpayers and for us. That's why, for example, we decided not to implement electronic invoicing. We decided that it will take too much of work for the taxpayers. What we've done, we told that we made an amendment in legislation where we said that now every taxpayer have to provide us tax returns electronically. That was the first step. Second step, we asked them to put in this tax return data with primary ledgers, where we can see data from VAT invoices. And that helped us to make a system where we could connect every chain of VAT from import till export or till consumption. That was the first step. The second step, before we usually thought that when we implement some kind of analytical instrument, that's enough to make a nice dashboard for somebody to work in. But usually when somebody works with it, it doesn't give all results what we could gather from the data. And we decided to implement processing analytics. What does it mean? It means that when something doesn't connect, for example, I show invoice, you doesn't show refund or vice versa, then the system sends email to the taxpayer that something is wrong with the data. And if taxpayer reacts automatically because the ERP system of tax service and of taxpayer, they're connected, then nothing happens. If they don't react, then it goes to tax officers. That's the first thing. And what I saw, that it's very strange, but taxpayers react on a behavior of machine better than on our behavior, because we show them, you see, that's not we, it's technology. We can change something if it's wrong, but if it's not, then you have to react. And that helped us to make VAT gap from 8% till less than 1%. The other thing is, at the beginning, I thought that the most difficult thing would be to implement such a system. But then I understood that it's not correct, and it would be much difficult. It was much more difficult to implement the system into business processes of the tax officers, because this interconnection between process and data, it's absolutely new, and everybody have to be inside of this. So we change processes on the principle of data-centric approach, where everybody works in one field. And the other thing, what we see now, is that during the implementation of VAT electronic invoices, that usually when we implement something, we think about ourselves, about us as a tax service, what we can gather from it. But if we would look at this process through the eyes of taxpayer, that maybe it's not crucial to implement just electronic invoices. Maybe it would be much more crucial to implement all data and document flow for B2B segment, so that they will have their own income, they will have their own benefits. Because if we implement only VAT, it's for us. Let's be true to ourselves. But if we will do it for them, then it will be much easier to implement. They will have, as taxpayers, will have their benefits, and we can get our benefits. And then maybe we can make a huge discussion, which Katherine outraced, with self-assessment. Are we sure that's the only way? Maybe if we will have all the data in and out, maybe we can take non-productive costs from taxpayers and calculate VAT by ourselves. Thank you very much.
Very interesting point, Daniel. I have discussed with my colleagues, Michael King, who is in the call, this issue of how far taxpayer service could go in order to almost do the tax compliant by taxpayer, still remaining in the taxpayer service approach. But anyway, that's an interesting debate. Now, let me give the floor to Margarita. As I mentioned, Uruguay is a country that has VAT for quite some time. Margarita, please tell us about the experience on managing VAT compliance and having a very good and low compliance gap in Uruguay. And I will advise the participants that Margarita is going to speak in Spanish, so take your time to get your translation accordingly. And now, Margarita, puedes empezar tu presentación. Muchas gracias por participar en este interesante webinar. The floor is yours.
Muy buenos días a todos. Bueno, nosotros vamos a hablar del IVA en el Uruguay. El IVA en el Uruguay ya hace casi 50 años que está funcionando. Y a lo largo de todo este tiempo ha tenido no ha habido cambios significativos en el impuesto. Está caracterizado por una base imponible que alcanza en general a todos los bienes y servicios. Tiene una tasa básica del 22% y una tasa reducida o mínima del 10%. Dispone también de exoneraciones y un régimen de tasa cero para las exportaciones. En cuanto a la evasión en Uruguay está en el orden del 14%. Nosotros utilizamos el método del consumo para hacer la medición de la evasión en Uruguay, y la tendencia que surge de los estudios es que va a continuar en baja, si bien con una curva un poco más suavizada en los últimos y los próximos años, ¿verdad? La recaudación del IVA representa aproximadamente el 45% de la recaudación de la DGI, por lo que tiene una incidencia importante en el peso de los impuestos que administra la DGI. Estamos hablando de 9,5% del PBI. Pero tratando de ser escueta en esta presentación o breve, nos vamos a referir a algunas razones que nosotros identificamos por las cuales en Uruguay la evasión del IVA es baja. Entendemos que uno de los pilares más importantes es disponer de un registro único de contribuyentes con una clara identificación de los sujetos pasivos del impuesto y que permanentemente se hagan acciones periódicas de depuración del RUT. La amplia base de imposición también es un elemento importante al haber pocas excepciones o tratamientos diferenciales del impuesto. El régimen, a su vez, tiene una pata muy importante, que es un régimen de percepción y retención del impuesto en etapas previas a la etapa final, como una forma de, cuando se han detectado áreas de la economía propensas a la informalidad, En las etapas finales se ha designado agentes de retención, lo que tiene un efecto muy importante para la base del cumplimiento del impuesto. Otro pilar importante a nuestro juicio es el régimen de documentación de operaciones, que de alguna manera está regulado por la Dirección General Impositiva. La obligatoriedad de sustentar el IVA deducible de la documentación de operaciones con determinadas características y siendo la DGI el rector de eso, conlleva a que nosotros de alguna manera determinemos los lineamientos de cómo documentar las operaciones y evitemos la no documentación de operaciones por parte de los contribuyentes. Por supuesto que también las declaraciones juradas electrónicas son un pilar fundamental en el control del IVA. En este momento todas las declaraciones juradas del IVA se recepcionan por medios electrónicos, si bien se mantiene para alguna actividad específica de algún otro impuesto, alguna declaración que nos permanece siendo en papel. Con respecto a aspectos importantes en la gestión propia del IVA, son las gestiones masivas de control de cumplimiento, de control tributario, para detectar omisiones de presentación de declaraciones juradas, consistencia de los datos ahí declarados y el seguimiento de los pagos del impuesto, que en definitiva es el objetivo de una administración tributaria. La medición y el seguimiento continuo de las brechas de declaración jurada y pago de varios impuestos, incluido el IVA, es también un pilar fundamental para asegurar el cumplimiento de los contribuyentes. Al punto que la administración tributaria, en el marco del compromiso de sus actividades con las autoridades, en este caso en Uruguay el Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, en este momento, en los últimos años tenemos objetivos de brechas, de alcanzar determinadas brechas en el cumplimiento de presentación de declaraciones juradas o de pago, que hacen que nosotros le dediquemos un especial interés en la gestión del grado de cumplimiento de los contribuyentes. Por supuesto que esos valores son establecidos en forma previa a que se empiecen a realizar las actividades de gestión y control de la administración tributaria. Por otra parte, tenemos una gestión sistemática sobre las devoluciones del IVA y sobre el IVA deducido o soportado por los contribuyentes. En el año 2003, cuando todavía las declaraciones juradas se hacían en papel, se instauró un formulario en el cual al inicio solamente las grandes empresas, los grandes contribuyentes, luego se fue agregando otro tipo de contribuyentes de menor porte. Con ese formulario lo que los contribuyentes presentan es un resumen de todas las operaciones entre empresas en las cuales hay un IVA compras, y eso nos permite obtener información, nos permitió desde el año 2003 obtener información y cruces masivos entre las partes que a su vez tenían intereses opuestos entre ellos, ¿verdad? Esto, sumado a los cruces de la información proveniente de las tarjetas de crédito por las operaciones que se realicen con pagos electrónicos, de alguna manera también es una forma de controlar las ventas al consumidor final. En este momento, ya hablando en una época más cercana, nos estamos inclinando por cruces masivos con información proveniente de las declaraciones, de la facturación electrónica y también de las administradoras de créditos en lo que respecta a los controles del IVA, ¿verdad? Finalmente, o siguiendo la línea esta de la facturación electrónica, nosotros desde el año 2012 tenemos el sistema de facturación electrónica aplicándolo en forma piloto en el 2012. Hoy por hoy el 96% de los comprobantes fiscales emitidos son en forma electrónica. Este sistema presenta múltiples ventajas para todos los que intervienen, ¿no? No solamente para la administración tributaria, sino que también tenemos que pensar con los ojos del contribuyente, como nos decía Daniel hace unos instantes, ¿verdad? En ese sentido, la facturación electrónica tiene ventajas porque permite la formalización de la economía, un mayor control de la evasión, y disponer de información en cuanto a cantidad, calidad y control, pero también para los contribuyentes representa menores costos, impacta positivamente en el medio ambiente y también en muchos casos disminuye los costos de los operativos de los contribuyentes, ¿verdad? En particular también con miras a facilitar el cumplimiento de los contribuyentes, nosotros en este momento estamos desarrollando una herramienta para que los contribuyentes de IVA de servicios personales le podamos facilitar también unas declaraciones juradas precargadas en base a la información que ellos nos proporcionan producto de la facturación electrónica, ¿verdad? En términos generales y con el ánimo de ser breve, estas serían las principales razones o pilares sobre los cuales basamos nuestro control de la evasión en Uruguay. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Margarita. Dear panelists, now we go to the second round, and I will ask you if it's possible to be brief in the second round, to max a couple of minutes each, so we could start with the dialogue with the attendees. That would be my pledge at this time. And as mentioned in the previous round, Michael, you would explain in brief the approach you took in the research for measuring compliance burden. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, Juan, I will try to be brief, but I need to explain the method that we used quite clearly. So, as I suggested in my opening remarks, what we did was we identified features of a VAT system that are burdensome, and what we did, we accumulated these features by using a panel of experts, which included academics and administrators. We then weighted those features, so not every feature had the same value in our matrix. And then we piloted this examination, this diagnosis, I should say, of VAT in particular countries across 13 countries. In the process of piloting that, we, of course, identified things that we'd missed and things that we needed to adjust. And so we made a number of refinements and improvements. We then felt that we had a robust enough tool, which then went out to 47 countries, OECD members and other members of the Forum on Tax Administration, which, of course, you will understand probably biased our sample to, the stronger, the more well-off countries and better resourced administrations. And we ran it in those 47 countries using a tax professional in each jurisdiction and with the facility for them to speak to the tax administration for clarification of certain things. The features that we identified, I'll be brief because I could go on for ages telling you about each one, but the features were generally at the highest level complexity and the burden based on complexity. Then the other features, so that was our factor A. Our factor B was the number and frequency of administrative requirements. Factor C looked at the capacity and capabilities of the revenue body itself. And then our factor D was monetary costs and benefits, for example, cash flow costs, which is really focusing on refunds. And we found in many of the countries that we ran this diagnosis on, they had a complexity problem. So this is a policy framework issue rather than anything that the administration is doing, because they had things like multiple rate structures, exemptions, and things that add to complexity. They didn't always have simplified rules for computing liabilities for small enterprises. And so, the rules were the same whether you were big or small. And of course, whether you're big or small affects your capacity to comply, and therefore the burden you bear, because there's regressivity and compliance costs too. We also found there was a lack of, sorry, not a lack, there were quite low registration thresholds, thus extending the VAT to many, many businesses, and by implication, many businesses that couldn't really cope with it, or couldn't cope with it efficiently. So in the complexity and burden, those were the factors that really stood out. Multiple rates and structures, multiple rate structures, I should say, and exemptions causing complexity, lack of simplified rules for simpler entities, and quite low registration thresholds. In terms of number and frequency of administrative requirements, we found there were often some quite burdensome information requirements, and these of course increase the potential for errors, and are actually recognized as a deterrent to compliance. If it's too hard to comply, there's a tendency not to comply, or not to comply fully. In terms of revenue body capabilities, we found that sometimes there were inadequate or poorly designed support activities, particularly for newly registered businesses. So no way of inducting new businesses into the VAT system in a supportive way which would sustain their compliance as the business grew. And on the monetary costs and benefits, we actually found the biggest feature there was delays in payments of refunds, often with no interest or very low interest rates, or compensation for having held on to the taxpayers' money for that length of time. Now, I know that's a very contentious point, because that's also an area of fraud. But just as it's an area in which fraud takes place, it's an area in which costs are quite severely imposed. So that's a summary of what we identified, and I'm happy to discuss it further.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now I will give the floor to Mary. Mary, in Africa, the penetration of internet, particularly the use of payment system, has been quite significant. How this has impacted VAT compliance management, and how do you see the future for further development of this?
Thank you again, Juan, and I will be brief. I will respond to the question that you raised by looking at two areas: the digitization of tax administration processes and the development of compliance regimes for cross-border supply of digital services. So on the digitization of tax administration processes, despite the unstable power supply and inadequate financing infrastructure, as well as low taxpayer adoption rates, you can see growth, clear growth in the adoption of technology in the administration of VAT on the continent. So some countries have developed technology for matching of invoices for input tax claim purposes, like Kenya. Other countries have automated the VAT charge at the point of sale and real-time provision of transaction data for revenue assurance purposes, like Nigeria and Rwanda, while yet others, like Malawi, have deployed fiscalized electronic devices. Generally, most administrations are migrating to electronic filing systems and enacting necessary legal frameworks that then enable them to use these digital channels as official means of communication to taxpayers, and means that are really acceptable. So generally, the outlook for digitization of tax administration on Africa, though still in its infancy, has a good outlook for future growth. And Juan and colleagues, ATAF is looking into soon publishing a guidebook on the adoption of ICT in tax administration to facilitate this progress. Then with regard to cross-border goods and services, an example that I can give here is maybe South Africa has really heralded the implementation of VAT compliance framework for cross-border supply of digital services in Africa. The framework, of course, is in line with the OECD guidelines, but I would like to give some of examples of the countries that have implemented some of these regimes. And Kenya has implemented its regime, and this became active in 2020. Rwanda, Ghana, and Nigeria are all progressing towards the implementation of new measures to capture revenue from these cross-border transactions. And while all this is happening, ATAF is working with them to try and help them implement regimes that, while taking cognizance of the sovereignty of these countries, making sure that they still also bear the global best practices of simplicity and ease of compliance. And we recently had the launch of a VAT digital toolkit together with the OECD in December of 2020. And so it is clear that part of this will be to help countries really develop their regimes based on a model that is really an international best practice. So I would say that this is really high on the agenda, and everybody realizes that it's the way to go. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Mary. And this is a good introduction for Daniel, who can share the experience of this journey, because Russia has really invested a lot, and particularly in the use of big data for monitoring compliance and managing compliance. So Daniel, please tell us a bit about the real tax compliance with the use of big data, and what are the preconditions to do so?
Thank you very much, Juan. First, what I would like to start with is that what I see that when you start your digital transformation, it becomes like never-ending story. So there is no end for this transformation, and this transformation happens every day. That's first what you have to be ready to work with. The other thing, it's very interesting to identify on what level of maturity are you. And there is one simple question. When somebody asks you, what information do you need? And when you say I need all information, that means that you have a big problem with the digital maturity. Only when you overeat, only then you understand that you have to work only with the information that you need. Every extra information is what we, if compare data with the sound, we call it noise, data noise. If you gather a lot of data noise, that means that it won't work well. The other thing is that when we decided that we have to gather all the data together, you remember we talked a lot, and Mr. Mishustin talked with you about it. It was very difficult to do, but we have a principle which Mr. Mishustin always proclaims. It's better ugly but alike. It means that it's better to have one point of source of information which you can change. If there would be a lot of different information about one essence, then it would be very, very difficult to work with. So what we are doing, first of all, we invested a lot into infrastructure. You have to work with infrastructure. That means that you can't look at yourself just as at tax administration. You have to look at the principles at which digital companies work, and you have to implement these principles in your work. The other thing is that you have to work a lot on hard skills, because tax officers, no longer tax officers that we know like 10 years ago, they have to have hard skills, how to work with data, how to work with dashboards, how to work with OLAP cubes, and so on and so on. And the third thing is, but as you said, not least, is the culture of working with data, which you have to invest a lot in. If you don't have this culture, you will have big problems, because, for example, we had a huge problem of communication of our methodological directorates with IT directorates. They don't understand each other. And if you don't have this interconnection, you will never have what you want from the building of any code of any data which you work with. And the other thing which I think would be interesting for us, that we have to be ready as tax administrations to work with external big data. Well, we always think that data is something which we own in our databases. But we have to understand that if we don't work with the data which have our sources of data, any source, taxpayer, other officials, I don't know, and so on, if we don't work with these sources of how the information be built and gathered, then you won't get good results. And everybody would spend much more money, time, and nerves on what they are doing with information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. I'm glad that you here at the time where the Commissioner Mishustin was in place and had the opportunity to visit the FTS. So it was really great. So Margarita, now turning the floor to you to tell us about the experience with VAT refund. As Michael raised, one of the big burden is the bad management of refund and the difficult kind of balancing act of being very efficient in delivering refund, but also be cautious about the potential fraud, because refund is always a source of fraud. So how your administration managed this refund to be efficient on one hand, but particularly to be careful of not having too much fraud in that area?
Bueno, yo creo que el principal mecanismo adoptado por Uruguay para evitar el fraude en las devoluciones fue la implantación de los certificados de crédito en forma muy temprana. Yo hace casi 38 años que estoy en la administración tributaria y desde que existo están los certificados de crédito. Por lo cual no pude investigar la fecha a partir de la cual existen estos, ¿verdad? Nosotros tenemos en este momento tenemos distintos tipos de certificados de crédito. Hay 5 tipos que los voy a clasificar en tres grandes grupos para simplificar la presentación. Los certificados de crédito para pagos de la propia empresa, en impuestos de la DGI o en impuestos a la seguridad social. Los certificados de crédito que puede endosar a otras empresas, también para pagos en la DGI o para el Banco de Previsión Social, que es los aportes a la Seguridad Social, y un tercer tipo que serían los certificados de libre endoso. Los primeros, los que son para pagos para la propia empresa, son certificados que puede utilizar la empresa para pagar otros tributos, no necesariamente el IVA, y son el grupo de certificados que tienen que ver con créditos en los cuales se le aplican controles, pero son los menos rigurosos. Los certificados endosables constituyen el volumen más grande de los certificados de crédito. La mayoría corresponden a devoluciones de IVA a través de contribuyentes que entregan a los, le pagan al contribuyente el servicio o la compra, pero retienen el IVA y el IVA lo pagan con ese certificado de crédito que después obtienen, y ese certificado a su vez tiene una fecha valor que puede ser utilizado para un pago que a otro contribuyente su vencimiento fue anterior, ¿verdad? Los certificados de libre endoso son lo más parecido a las devoluciones, y están restringidas para determinadas operaciones, ¿verdad? Esa aplicación de este mecanismo le permite a la DGI saber quién genera el crédito y quién lo utiliza, posibilitando una serie de controles que evitan notablemente el fraude en el IVA. Por ejemplo, en una solicitud de un certificado para el pago de un IVA a un proveedor, el contribuyente debe explicar cuáles son los proveedores a los cuales le va a dar esos créditos, y la administración chequea la solvencia y la veracidad de esos proveedores, y se verifica ese cruzamiento para que el proveedor efectivamente que informó ventas sobre el monto solicitado verifique que las razones justifican esa devolución. De forma tal que la clasificación de diferentes tipos de certificados basados en el uso posible que esos certificados puedan tener acelera mucho el control, identifica los universos, entregamos devoluciones utilizando ese mecanismo, y en los casos de los certificados para pagos de la propia empresa, que son los que tienen menos controles menos rigurosos, el riesgo real es sensiblemente inferior y esa entrega se hace de forma muy rápida, 2 o 3 días. ¿Verdad? Sin embargo, en el marco, me interesa recalcar que en el marco del control de cumplimiento tributario, el modelo de riesgos de control de los certificados es fundamental. Eso forma parte de nuestras principales preocupaciones y es un proceso que tiene un gran componente de automatización de los controles, ¿verdad? Si bien cuando se inició el régimen, los certificados de créditos se emitían en papel, se hacían en un papel de seguridad, por supuesto, no era una hoja simple, con el paso del tiempo estos certificados son electrónicos. Al momento casi el 90% de los certificados que entregamos son digitales. Solamente algunos de los certificados de libre endoso son los que hoy por hoy se mantiene su entrega en papel. Otro gran elemento que nosotros entendemos como que forma parte de los controles y de la detección del fraude, quisiera mencionar que, por ejemplo, en el año 2016, la administración detectó, gracias a estos sistemas de control instaurados, un fraude masivo del IVA a través de la utilización de empresas de papel para generar documentación apócrifa, que fue utilizada para deducir IVA a ventas y también impuesto a la renta. Ese formulario que yo en mi anterior presentación hice referencia, que nos permite contar con información cruzada, sólida y completa, permitió a la administración detectar y recuperar el 80% de los montos de defraudación estimados, que ascendieron a, estuvo en el orden de los 10 millones de dólares. Es importante destacar que este mecanismo permite una comunicación, permitió que le comunicáramos en forma precisa a los contribuyentes que habían utilizado esas facturas apócrifas, las facturas detectadas, el periodo y la fecha, por lo que el 40% de los contribuyentes a quienes convocamos voluntariamente regularizaron su situación y un 22% regularizó parcialmente, lo cual desde el punto de vista de la administración consideramos como exitoso el operativo en la detección de ese fraude. A su vez también este mecanismo de detección permitió reducir los recursos de las áreas de fiscalización, destinándolos específicamente para los casos que eran más graves, ¿verdad? Y hoy en día el crecimiento del régimen de facturación electrónica hace que este escenario de empresas fantasmas se reduzca sensiblemente, sin duda, ¿verdad? Por último, resaltar los controles que en cuanto al IVA hacemos, y solamente los voy a enumerar en aras de ser breve en el tiempo. Nosotros hacemos controles en el IVA en cuanto, como ya señalé, la omisión o el atraso de las declaraciones, la omisión o el atraso en el pago correcto del impuesto que había sido declarado, la consistencia de las retenciones deducidas con relación a las retenciones informadas por terceros, la consistencia de las declaraciones juradas en relación a la información que surge de la facturación electrónica, la consistencia de las declaraciones con información de terceros, el control sobre empresas que facturan IVA, como falta de la frecuencia en las omisiones o la frecuencia en la pérdida de documentación, el control del IVA a deducir en las empresas que lo generan, para las empresas que presentan solicitud de IVA.
Thank you, thank you very much, Margarita. And I would like to thank the panelists. We are getting to the end of our webinar. This has been a pretty exciting conversation in such an important tax to administer. Definitely the experience share here will help us all. And to the attendees, just to mention that all your Q&A will be responded and put in the website of the webinar. Just to make a recap on what we have heard today. Definitely compliance gap, it's an issue in some regions. Compliance gap with VAT in some region with low-income countries, it's quite significant in terms of revenue lost. In region and countries that VAT is the main revenue mobilization vehicle, as mentioned by some of the participants. So addressing non-compliance is very important, particularly in the sectors that contribute the most to non-compliance. And as shown in the presentation today, there is some specific sectors that are difficult for compliance, collection, manufacture, services, and trade, and those related to VAT refunds. And also we learned that there is an approach to address those issues. It's not that we just relying in the self-assessment and try to hope that taxpayer compliance purely by themselves. There is a need to develop compliance enforcement activities and embedded in a sound compliant risk management approach that take into account also the cost of compliance. So it's not controlling compliance at any cost. Leveraging technology for doing that, it's quite important. And we have heard here experiences how different regions are really investing in technology and pursuing technology as a good driver for improving compliance. The issue of data is crucial, and there is a connection between using technology and having more available data. But as Daniel said, it's not mature when we said we want all information. Definitely that's not right. In its information that we will use for facilitating taxpayer compliance, for making our compliance strategies more effective in pursuing a high level of compliance. We interestingly, we hear a framework that is being put in place to have a more systematic approach to compliance burden. And we appreciate that, the work that is being doing in the University of South Wales, Australia, and Michael and the team with a more standardized approach and consider several aspects, which is important. It's try to make an objective assessment of compliance cost. It's not just some random sort of approaches. And the good thing is that this framework has been piloted, so there is certainly a tested tool, and this tested tool is leading to some precondition for having lower compliant costs, as well as there is some precondition to have more efficient and effective tax administration, as Katherine mentioned, as Daniel mentioned, in terms of using technology, for example. And definitely there is a need to have this vision of compliance from a comprehensive perspective. So there is aspect of compliant services, enforcement, strategies, data, technology, concern about the definitely the cost of taxpayers. And something that also was said, which is always important to have in mind, is the concept of B2B, which doesn't mean business to business, it means back to basic. So taxpayer compliance cycles are relatively standard as a process. No matter what is the technology we leverage, there is certain steps that taxpayers compliance cycle need. Registered, filing returns, providing data, eventually receiving services and audits, being a part of a compliance net. And this is important. It's important how the different steps and processes are modernized, digitalized, like the invoices or the POS system with the connectivity in real time, collection of data. So there is an underlying compliance cycle that VAT has to go through, but any tax has in mind. So digitalizing those cycles is what helps not only taxpayers, but also the administration. And something that Daniel mentioned more than once is that to put ourselves in the shoes of the taxpayers, instead of just thinking about the administration, okay, what is good for taxpayers, particularly when the taxpayer it's an investor in our countries. It's an economic agent. That the reason why they become taxpayer is because they are developing an economic activity, and ultimately taxpayer compliance should aim to facilitate that economic activity, not put an additional burden and additional cost. On the contrary, how tax administration and how the tax compliance cycle actually leverage a much modern taxpayer compliance business cycle. And this is ultimately what we are aimed for. This is the fourth webinar of a series of 4. But we have received through the polling system and emails from participants the need to continue with this series. And we will be planning the next steps in the coming weeks, and we will share and let you know how we will continue this dialogue that we have found particularly useful for all of us, certainly here in the IMF, but we have seen for the level of participation, we have more than 600 participants here. And we appreciate your willingness to engage in this dialogue. And we will definitely develop a new series of webinar in a topic as interesting as VAT in the coming weeks. So I would like to, again, reiterate my thanks to Katherine for the opening presentation and the panelists for wonderful experience you have shared with all of us. Definitely, in the end, the tax family grows with this sharing of information and help us all, not only being more effective tax administration, but definitely help the country and help the taxpayer to meet their obligation in a better way and contribute to the revenues that are so much needed, particularly in times of this pandemic. So I do appreciate the patience of the panelists and the attendees, and I would like to thank you and ask for a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much, and good to see you. Have a good day, the rest of you, a good night, those that are on the other side of the globe. Thank you very much, colleagues. All the best.